Hello, I'm Suzanne Gibbs Howard. We're here for another Creative Confidence series. I'm here today with the fabulous Bryan Walker. Welcome. Glad
Hello.
you're here. And today we are very excited because we're going to give everyone a sneak peek of our newest course that's launching in November. And it is one that I'm incredibly excited about. Bryan is someone who I've worked with for many, many years. He's been here at IDEO for 18 years. You know, he looks like he's 12. He's old enough to have worked here for 18 years. And he has helped numerous leaders and organizations to transform their cultures and their organizations to be more innovative, more creative, more adaptive, and to really increase their impact in the world. So we'll talk about all of that and more today. Bryan is going to give us a little glimpse and a little live lesson of the course that we've designed together. So, you know, he's also just co-authored an article that's in Harvard Business Review with Sarah Sewell from the Stanford Graduate School of Business. And that piece is also about driving change and culture change in organizations through movements, not mandates. And it's very interrelated with everything that we're going to talk about today. So, with that, I just wanted to help you guys get to know a little bit about Bryan. Bryan, maybe if you could start off by sharing with us how you got interested in using design for change.
Okay. So as Sue mentioned, I've been at IDEO for a little while, and I think in terms of when I got interested in using design to drive change, there's probably two seminal moments in my design career. The first was uh, the first time that I saw somebody using a product that I actually designed, right, a part of shaping, and I think that was actually a baby stroller, and that was one of those moments where you remember kind of why you do this is ultimately to create something that lives out in the world and has a positive impact on people's lives. However, that was obviously a moment of pride, but it was also one where I started to wonder why it had taken so long to get to this point, because it was several years into my career. And I think at that point, I started getting interested in how do you actually navigate organizations to get an idea out in the world. Because a lot of the work before that never made it, there were great ideas too. They just didn't, I don't think I had the knowledge about how to actually interface with an organization to make it happen. So that was the first. And then the second one was actually when I was in Southern California at a shopping mall, and it was at South Coast Plaza. And this was 3 years after a retail store that I had designed had been opened up. And so it was a new concept for a company called Allen Edmonds. And the store they created was a perfect sort of manifestation of the vision that I had imagined. But I came back 3 years after that. And what I saw was the store was exactly the same, which was kind of cool, but also kind of lame because the world had evolved and it hadn't. So I started getting really interested in, well, how is it that you actually build the capacity for continuous innovation within a company so that it's not just about one time creating something new, but continuously evolving that, making it better and better as the world evolves too. And so those were the two things that kind of put me on this trajectory where I became kind of obsessed with change.
Yeah, yeah, I can understand. I think a lot of us here have that experience, and a lot of people working in innovation have that experience too. It's hard enough to get something all the way to market, but then on top of that, it needs to continue to evolve and adapt to maintain its impact in society. I'm curious also why you are working with organizations now. Is there anything that's changed to make this even more of an urgent need in the way the marketplace is changing today?
Yeah. I get that question a lot, and I think the answer is simple: is that change has changed. So the speed, the complexity that organizations are having to deal with, and the pace of change is much more accelerated than it used to be. There's often debate on whether or not this is true, but I know for sure that everybody at least feels that and believes that. And as a result, organizations are finding that while they used to, in more of a static world, be able to really kind of compete around optimizing themselves for doing what they currently do, usually more efficient, cheaper, more consistently. Now they're realizing that equally they need to have that muscle of being able to cultivate tomorrow's stuff. And so they still need to optimize, but they also need to innovate and continuously evolve in order to kind of keep up with all the unexpected changes.
So change is the new constant, right? It's the only
Correct.
thing that we can absolutely rely on is that it's going to be different tomorrow than it is right now.
Yes.
And so, what are some of the things that you see putting pressure on us? What are some of the patterns around things that are making us need to deal with change so constantly?
Yeah. Well, there's a thing called the internet. Um, if you don't know what the internet is, you should definitely check it out. the, so I actually, joking aside, is the information, the reality that we live in the digital world, and the pace of communication, the
Mhm.
access to information has changed a lot. It's also on top of that digital infrastructure is it's disrupted basically a lot of the old mechanisms that would constrain new entrants into markets.
Yeah.
So you don't need as significant of assets anymore to be able to enter into some markets. So that's creating a lot of disruption.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure all of you out there are feeling that as part of the things that you're doing. So I know we always love to learn by doing, and we love to think about sharing some of the things that we're working on through these webcasts. And so today, I know you had a little live lesson
Okay.
prepared that you wanted to share with people. That gives just a tiny glimpse into the Designing for Change course. And this course is about figuring out how to help organizations shift their culture and their zeitgeist in ways that aren't so top down. So through movements, not mandates, and really doing that as a means to have a more sustained impact. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I thought we'd dive into your activity that you
Okay.
wanted to bring.
So, the place to begin is with a congratulations to all of you because you are now the CEO of a large global company. So, take a moment, soak in your success, take that in. However, with great reward comes great responsibility. And as the CEO, you do see the need for change ahead. This organization that you now run, it has grown considerably over the years. It's now in 70 countries with more than 20,000 employees. But as a result of that, it's gotten pretty bloated in terms of bureaucracy. Decision making has become much more complex and convoluted. And you certainly have kind of competing groups in the organization with competing strategies and all the lovely politics that go along with that. So it's making things very difficult to get anything done. The problem is that the market you're in now is getting commoditized. So it means that you got to change. You're going to have to figure out a new way to create value, which is going to require you to do things differently. And you don't have all the time in the world. So, given that scenario, the question for all of you is where would you begin as the new CEO?
Okay, and so we are putting up a little bit of a poll here in the chat. Let's go ahead and show that visually as well. And so we've got some options here for you to choose from. And so we want you to really think about this. Imagine you've just gotten this new role. I think this is a very common situation that people see, and they're in charge of a new change. But how would you tackle it? And so we've got a couple options here for you that are some different patterns that we've seen. Would you redesign the incentives? Would you restructure the organization? We'll leave this open for 1 minute so that people can vote, or you can also chat in your response. Would you redefine a common purpose for the organization? Would you rethink your leadership team? What about rethinking the processes and the approaches in the organization? Would you downsize the organization? It's gotten bloated. Last, to introduce new roles and talents, or would you experiment with new ways of working? So lots of options in there. We can see some of the votes rolling in. I know, Bryan, you've been involved in a number of organizations going through this moment and ones that are a little bit smaller as well. What are some of the things that you see happening to leaders when they come into a moment of change?
Yeah, well, I think as you'll often see that there's a knee-jerk reaction a lot of times to try to actually make the change happen very quickly. And when you're in a position of authority, one way you can do that is to essentially re-architect the organization. So there's a lot of those options up there kind of fall in that bucket, where maybe you're either restructuring the decision making, or coming up with new processes, or rethinking incentives to motivate people. That's often a place that one can go. With that, though, it can be quite effective, but it also can be quite risky, because a lot of times people will feel like they're being changed rather than a part of a change.
Hmm.
And as the CEO, you have one perspective, and it may not always be the most informed or the right one. So there's also risk there. Essentially, the other way you can approach it is by looking at, well, how is it that you can actually drive significant change through influence rather than necessarily through authority? And that takes you down more of the path of really engagement and mobilizing people around the change and starting to take action that shows potential.
Yeah. I'm going to pause you there for a second. I think we'll go. Did we close the poll already? And the results are in. As usual, the community that we have gathering here is very insightful. And so we definitely have a spike around redefining common purpose as one of the ways to start. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, and experimenting with new ways of working. And then in a distant third, rethink processes. So thank you everyone for voting and playing a little bit of a game with us. I think to Bryan's point, we'd like to talk a little bit more about, there are the usual ways to tackle change, and sometimes the speedier ways that are much more top down, mandated by an authority in the organization. But when we want to get change to stick and really move through culture, I know you have a story that you can tell us about where this challenge was really real with Dr.
Certainly.
Reddys.
So the scenario I painted what is not a hypothetical one. It's one that at IDEO we had the pleasure of working on for a company called Dr. Reddys. So they're an India-based pharmaceutical company, and their CEO is GV Prasad. So I was working directly with him. And the approach that we ended up taking was one where, like many of you recommend, we first started by taking a step back and sort of thinking about people and really engaging them around a larger question, which was why do we exist as a group beyond the pure pursuit of profit? Once we began to galvanize people around sort of a higher purpose, then we started looking at, well, what is it that Dr. Reddy's does? And where are there opportunities to do some things differently in order to show the potential benefits of working differently? And get people in the organization to begin to believe that change was possible. Once we had started building momentum around some of those actions, it's then that we had more insight into how some of the larger organizational systems might need to change to better support this new way of being. And that way we then backed into some of these more traditional moves that one might make in terms of organizational change.
And so the purpose that you sort of rallied everyone around was around good health can't wait, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's just such a beautiful articulation of something that was present in their organization, but maybe not at the highest level just yet.
Yeah, because you'll find that within I think there's a few things when you really think about a good purpose. One is that it's not fabricated, but it's actually more surface from within the group. There'll be kernels of it that already exist. Maybe it hasn't been clearly articulated, but there is a sentiment that exists there, and you're just putting words to a pre-existing sentiment. And then the last thing that I think is really important about a purpose, beyond it being kind of authentic, emotionally compelling, is it needs to be in service of other. I think it's really important that you end up being able to start galvanizing people around something that you care about that's in service of other, that's not of your own self-interest. Because that becomes particularly important once you get into change, where you need to elevate above standard politics or any self-interest. But instead you're looking at collective interests for others.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's much more on Dr. Reddys inside of our course, but I thought we'd flip forward just to introduce kind of a high level structure of the Designing for Change course. And so what's really important in this one is that we are taking the time to really share the process and the steps for making a change that will be quite sustained. And it can be inside of a team, inside of a community, inside of an organization. So I thought you could just talk at a high level of the three lessons that you've
Sure.
framed up.
Sure. I gotta say it's been a pleasure building this course with this team. I think what's fantastic about the process too is it forces us to take something quite complex and make it very accessible and simple. And at the core of this idea of creating change by movement, not mandate, which in other words is about creating change that sticks and doing it largely through influence and design, is really three things that you got to get good at. One is about mobilizing people around purpose. We just talked a little bit about that. The next is really about creating momentum through action. A lot of this focuses on doing some tangible things that aren't the full manifestation of the change you want to see, but it's just enough that gets people to start seeing the potential benefits and believing that the change may be possible. And then ultimately, the third is really about scaling and sustaining that change. And that gets into how is it that eventually you reshape the conditions around us to better support this new way of being.
Wonderful. Nice. I know one of the things we often talk about is starting small and making the changes. And so I know some of the questions that we've wrestled with and that we wanted to dive into, and we will open up for more questions from everyone in the community. So please go ahead and start submitting them if you'd like to. But one of the things that often comes up is, so great, GV Prasad, he's the CEO of Dr. Reddys, but what if I'm not the CEO?
Yeah.
How do I have, and I have to lead through. We know that even CEOs absolutely these days need to lead through influence and not always authority. But what if you don't have the option and you need to lead through influence? What are some of the things that you've wrestled with and helped people to do so that you can give ideas of how to start change from wherever you are?
Yeah, certainly. Yes, the reality is that the vast majority of us are not CEOs or presidents or any of these supposed positions of authority and power. However, I think it's important that we all realize that no matter where we sit, we have the ability to think about who is it that needs to be a part of the change and understand what do they aspire to. Does not matter where you sit in the organization to be able to start thinking that way and engaging people around trying to understand that collective aspiration. Um, and then certainly not being the CEO might mean you have a smaller canvas in which you can kind of draw upon, or more limited resources and access to making some changes that could begin to help produce kind of the new outcomes that you want. However, you will have some. You might be a smaller
Mhm.
canvas, but you still have a canvas. And I think you want to look at, well, what do you have kind of the ability to affect? And then think creatively about how you could use that as ways to begin to make a dent towards that change that you want to see. It's not the full realization of it, of course, but it's the beginnings of it. So I'll give you a few examples because that's always helpful. the, um, one person that I'm thinking about is a woman who was a manager of a business unit within a very large company. And she was one business amongst many. And the change she wanted to make was currently those businesses were very siloed and they actually saw each other as competition. And her vision was to actually begin to create connection across those businesses and greater collaboration. And I'm sure many of you can kind of relate to this desire to go from being siloed competitive to more kind of connected and collaborative. Anyhow, though, she didn't know where to begin, but I thought she was very creative where she ended up. And so she realized that, well, she has a weekly update with her team where they just share what's going on with the business. What are the things that they're doing and where the challenges they're grappling with? And she simply invited in some of her kind of colleagues from the other businesses just to sit in and join that meeting. And at first, there's only a limited few that maybe accepted the invitation, but those that started showing up began to realize how similar the challenges were across the
Mm.
businesses. And with that, over time, more and more of those patterns became very blatant to people. And eventually, several of the various businesses pooled resources together, and they actually started working on some of these projects that they all kind of shared, which, small thing she did, simply inviting a different set of people into the meeting she already had was really the beginnings that helped kind of put everybody down that path that started realizing the change she wanted.
That's so cool. I mean, I think one of the things I always see is doing small things, but then telling big stories about them, and also how one small action has this ripple effect. I saw an amazing one literally just last night where I think it's really nice to think about these patterns and behaviors and how they work across the community as well. And so in a neighborhood where I live, there was a really nasty little messy corner where a lot of cars would park and a lot of trash was gathering.
Yeah.
And so a group of kids from the school went over, cleaned up the garden, one small thing last Friday. And then just this morning, I got an email from somebody saying, that one of the other neighbors went, and because they saw that it was nicer and cleaner, they went and they hung a swing in the place. And so you're just starting to see how
Yeah.
you reset some of those conditions. You create a meeting where you're inviting a few more people in than normal, and all of a sudden that ripple effect starts to flow out and affect others.
Yeah.
So I think
And
they're just such beautiful dynamics.
yeah, and that's the thing that you see with this approach to change is it really does start small. But there is some art and some science to it, and figuring out, well, what are some of the small things you can do, and how do you go about doing those in ways that are likely to amplify that ripple effect. So that's definitely one of the things we get into, and particularly around building momentum around action, is starting to think about, well, how do you get some of those smaller wins that have that ripple effect.
Yeah, yeah. Another thing that I want to talk about, and we'll share more examples because I know it really helps to think about what does this look like and what does this feel like. I know that's something we've spent a lot of time talking about and thinking about is um, change is hard. How do you reframe that? And then what do you do with the hard part? So if you could talk a little bit about the patterns you've seen and how you've coached so many people through these
Yeah.
changes.
Well, that is definitely the dominant narrative around change, is that it's hard.
Mhm.
And there's truth to that. That change is hard. But I think our stance is to also see how beautiful it is and can be. Um, one of the things you have to realize is if you're an agent of change, you are going to be going against the grain. So you will be encountering just some natural friction. There will be some setbacks. Things will probably take way longer than you'd like and be more difficult than they should be. However, I don't think you ever get there. Uh, and I don't think you're as successful as an agent of change if you embrace that narrative, where it's just drudgery and this is difficult. Is instead, I think you have to actually realize that change is radically beautiful. As you're mentioning, it's one of the only constants in life, and within change is evolution and new growth. And sometimes the process can be difficult, but the outcomes are very beautiful. And particularly in hindsight, you can see the real beauty in them. I think you have to keep that mindset around the notion of change. And then the other one, though, that I think is a little bit more tactical is you have to realize that when you're starting, you're trying to push just some small acts through this system that's not really designed to produce the things that you want. Hence, you're trying to create change. Um, while you're encountering those frictions, rather than see it as such a annoyance or a negative, actually see it as a gift. Because what it's really illuminating is what about the larger system are you going to have to eventually double back on
Huh.
and begin to change if you want to actually scale out the change that you're trying to produce and ultimately create sort of the conditions around it that support it. So that's another one where it's like I'll always recommend with people when they're frustrated is actually create a journal and just start building a list of all the little pain points and the friction, because those things are actually little clues that you're going to double back on once you get to that point where you're thinking a little bit bigger about starting to scale and sustain that change.
Wow. So friction's not a pain. It's a
Yeah.
gift. And
Yes.
sometimes it might be a pain, but then how do you look at it closely and diagnose what needs to shift as a result? So I know we want to get to questions pretty soon, but I wanted to ask one
Okay.
more thing, which is just give us a little clue about then. So you've started small. You're putting some prototypes out in the world. You're seeing the friction. You're seeing the positive benefits and ripple effects. Fast forward 2 years, how are you going to sustain this change, especially if you're doing it through influence and not necessarily authority? What's one little story or clue you can give us about what plays out then?
Yeah. So there's a metaphor that we often will talk about too is, I mean, essentially a lot of creating change by movement really starts with aspiration and action and building momentum. But a lot of that comes by working around the existing organization systems. In other words, kind of the metaphor is you're swimming upstream,
Mhm.
which is just a part of change and being kind of pioneers for change. But at some point, if you're going to want to create this change in a way that can sustain itself and really be at scale, you're going to have to change the flow of the river so that the river is actually making it easier to act in this way rather than harder. And that comes down to really thinking about, well, what are those things that we design that create the conditions around us that really sort of support or discourage certain ways of behaving. And a lot of those really come down to some pretty basic things. One is really about strategy and the sort of setting the direction for a group or an organization. The other is structure. This is about decision making and where does power around key decisions exist. Then there's process, which is the flow of information activities. There is incentives, which is both the hard and the soft, which at the end
Mhm.
of the day is about motivation. There's people. There's sort of thinking about what are the systems you have around talent and getting the right mix of skill sets and mindsets. And then lastly, there's one which is more about infrastructure, and it's sort of the tools and the places that surround you and how they encourage and discourage certain behaviors. How you design those and how those work off of each other really create the conditions that encourage or discourage certain behaviors. And so a lot of that thinking is built off of a really well-known organizational designer called Jay Galbraith, and it's known as the STAR model. And I found it to be a great framework to build off of, simply because he asked the question, which was many hadn't asked, which was, what about an organization can you actually design?
Yeah, nice. Well, I want to go. I think that is a huge tome of lots of different things to work with. And I think we are so excited that you've shared this today and through the course. But I want to get to some of the questions. And one of the ones that I saw from Jenny is, what in the world does this have to do with design thinking? What are the connections between the process that you share through designing for change and coming back to the building blocks of a design thinking
Yeah.
approach?
That's an awesome question. It's a question that we get quite often. The main thing is a few things. One is realizing that design thinking at its core is about being human centered, right? And it's about first and foremost thinking about the people that we're designing for and their needs and aspirations. This is taking that notion of change and saying, how do you go and do it in a human centered way? Which I think a lot of that goes back to first and foremost, starting with people, thinking about who needs to be part of this change and what are their needs and aspirations. And then how do you actually begin to start the movement around that? So I think that's one of the key components. The other key component in it is realizing that you're going to have a lot of challenges along the way, which is thinking about, well, how do we actually begin to do some things that make progress towards this change and substantiate it? And that's where you need a creative problem solving approach.
Mhm.
And that's where you're often applying design thinking. In particular, I think a lot of that, the iterative nature of design thinking and more of the prototyping mindset, where you're trying out things to be able to start getting some quick wins to show people the potential benefits of this change you want to see, and getting people to believe that it actually just might be possible.
Yeah. So I think we're bringing some of the behaviors of design thinking. So the listening to people, making stuff and prototyping, and then testing and learning and iterating to a different kind of a larger scale change
Yeah.
process. I think that is beautiful. A couple more questions. So from Andrea M, we have a question about, how do you know when it's time to sit down and discuss common purpose? And I saw some other questions that are related to this one about people asking, what if people don't buy into the purpose? How do you sort of navigate the why and when, and then that how to rally people?
Yeah. Yeah, I find that it's the the need to be able to step back and find sort of a collective aspiration is often when there's a conflict because often change that you're trying to create, you have to think about multiple stakeholders. There's those that the change may be in service of, and then there's those who need to be part of delivering or realizing that change. And that's where there's a degree of complexity, because a lot of times it's not as simple as there's one person you're designing for. It's actually about mobilizing collective groups around a common kind of cause. So if there's competing motivations or beliefs there, that's often when those surface, that's a moment where you might want to step back and start saying, all right, well, what's the bigger thing that we're all caring about? And then now let's talk about, if that's true, then therefore, this is something that we might need to be doing. I think the thing that you got to realize, though, too, within this is that if you are trying to drive change, you have to be in service of
Hmm.
others. It's very easy for your own sort of beliefs and agenda to get mixed in, and I think it's important, like we always say within design thinking, is you might be the designer, but take a minute to step back and really understand who you're designing for, and you'll probably be inspired and surprised, and it may reshape what you think is the right way forward. You equally have to have kind of that stance and that mindset when you're looking at using design to drive
Yeah,
change.
yeah. And I love the way how, in a lot of our larger approaches where we're working closely with an organization or a team to catalyze or mobilize people, I've seen your group, Design for Change, really host events where people can participate in the purpose. And I wonder if you can describe some of the things. We have some questions. Storm is asking us, how do you mobilize people? And so you've articulated and you've framed, and I know in the course we talk a lot about the framing of the purpose,
Yeah.
but how do you help people buy into it
Yeah.
and create that dynamic?
Yeah, that's a really good a good question. There's a lot of good questions. I think one of the things that I've actually come to almost believe this is almost a human truism, that people support what they create. And I think that's one of the biggest secrets, is that you want to bring people into the process of creation, so that at the end of the day, it's not you trying to sell somebody on your idea, but it's actually coming to our idea. And that's very critical. And that doesn't mean, I mean, there is real, once again, kind of art and science to co-creation. That doesn't mean it's simply a vote on what's the right thing to do, but it's about engaging people in different ways and being very transparent about how sort of decisions and conclusions are made around that. And I found that if everybody feels like their voice and their contribution was truly appreciated and heard, they're going to be much more receptive to being a part of what comes out of the process.
Yeah, I've seen some of the things that our teams have done here at IDEO where they've designed events where the tone is very different. So I think oftentimes you think of change management and a large scale communications scheme across the company. So it's much more broadcast versus events that invite participation, invite a little bit of feedback. So things might be almost finished,
Hmm.
but not quite set in stone,
Yeah,
so that people have an opportunity to participate and co-create that
yeah.
solution.
And so I think the tone and the way you invite people into the process is really important. Another one in terms of mobilizing people is the power of storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
But what you often see in these kind of change management scenarios is they talk about the importance of communication. And a lot of times the communication is all these platitudes and kind of remarks about all the things we're going to do, which often, may sort of fall on deaf ears. I find that it's amazingly powerful to be able to understand, all right, well, what is the larger aspiration, the collective aspiration that all of this is in service of? But then I'm not going to talk about the things we're going to do. I'm going to talk about the things we have done.
Yeah.
And this is where some of the small acts, that even though they're small, they are things that have been done, that are proof points about the potential benefits of this change, and that there is that people are beginning to actually realize it. And so I find that a lot of what you should be talking about is some of the things that you've done, and then how they're emblematic of this larger change and what you're trying to begin to realize. That within that is you begin to actually convert those people that are sympathetic what you're trying to do, but they're actually just kind of still sitting on the sidelines.
Yeah.
It's once they start seeing some action, they begin to see some really clear ways in which they can get involved. You're going to begin to actually start mobilizing and building a little bit more of a crowd around it.
And I know you talk a lot about the small acts, the small things that break through. And we have some great questions about Javita's asking about skeptics and metrics.
Yeah.
And so I know every organization holds its metrics differently, but what are some of the things and patterns that you've seen around proof or evidence or indicators that a change is coming that help to turn some of those skeptics or people who aren't just ready to buy in and believe from the
Yeah.
outset?
Yeah. Yeah. I think I mean, one is it's important to think about the coalition you're building around the change that you're trying to pull off. And I think that there is, we'll often talk about there's the enthusiasts you want to consider, there's the sponsors you want to consider, and then there's the naysayers or the skeptics. It's very easy to over cater to the naysayers and skeptics. I think you have to be aware of them, and you can often learn a lot from engaging them, but don't get overly distracted by them at first. I think that's really important because some of them you'll never actually directly flip, but you might be able to build enough momentum and enough of a crowd that it kind of overcomes them. However, there's also the question around metrics that are tied in here too. And then that's always the really sort of the notion of thinking about inputs, throughputs, and outputs. A lot of times the metrics that people always bring up are ones that are really outputs.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you can actually dig into them, you can sometimes read the impossibility of those. And so a lot of times is one begin to often embrace that conversation and actually put together sort of a larger, more robust look at how are we trying to measure progress. And so that's the inputs, the throughputs, and then ultimately outputs.
What's an example of an input that you've seen an organization measure just to, again, keep that momentum going when it might take a long time to measure the output?
Yeah. So a lot of times you'll see ones that might actually be about capacity building. And so a very simple input in that is you can actually, if you're going to begin to run some sort of development thing, it's just actually seeing participation rates within that and growing participation rates. So that's one way that you can begin to get into that. A lot of times, then that might be tied to a certain capacity, believes they can drive such and such business results, and they might be asking for the business results, but you have to begin to back your way into that. The other one that I think you have to realize, though, too, is that a lot of times I think there's the quote that stories are data with soul. And so within this notion of metrics, I think those are really important. But you also have to realize that qualitative things can be very, very strong data points that can give you insight into whether or not you're making progress and whether or not you're doing the right thing.
Yeah.
And then my last thought on that one, because this one comes up all the time, is just because you can't measure something doesn't mean that it's not valuable. And I think sometimes we have to remind ourselves of that because, you know, some things are really difficult to measure.
Yeah. I think we do. I think to your point, we have a lot of things and we feel like there's this middle period where progress is being made, but it might not necessarily have the end financial benefit of having something launched and successful in market attached to it. So you need these interstitial metrics, the inputs and the throughputs. And then you'll get to the outputs eventually. And I know inside of the course, we talk a lot about those beacons for change. So places to start small, but where you can get something to market within a smaller time frame so that you can get more of that proof and the financial proof often that an organization needs to believe at the tippy top.
Yeah, I'll give you one example of that, which is, and sometimes you can pull this off and sometimes you can't, but to the metrics question and mobilizing people is, if you can find something you might be able to work on where you think through this change you might be able to produce outcomes that are better than the status quo, that are outcomes the organization already agrees matter, then those are places where you might want to orient. So there was one with a consumer electronics company, and what we were part of trying to create a movement around design thinking. And instead, this was a consumer electronics company that was very tech oriented. They built all their products off of specs, and they really didn't think about the user experience at all. And so one of the ways we began to mobilize and create momentum around this different approach and philosophy of design was we simply went up and we looked at their pipeline of products and we asked their lead engineer to show us the one that was stuck. What was the one that, like, there's pressure because this thing's got to be in market in a period of time and it's not going well right now?
Yeah.
And it was like, give us that one. And because it's already a low bar is set, and there's already it's intended to be go to market and in a short period of time. And then through that we could say, look at what you had before, look at this, is this better than this? And it produced some of the market outcomes that were higher than expectation. And with that, you can begin to actually start getting a little bit more belief in this different way of working.
Yeah, and I remember that effort, and it went to market pretty fast, relatively speaking, and then created that evidence, both financial and with positive consumer feedback. That it was great. I know we have a wealth of questions here that we're not even beginning to get to, but I really want to invite people to join the first run of Designing for Change, because in our classes, it's not just the education from our instructor, Bryan Walker, and more of the kinds of things that you're hearing, but it's also this community that comes together to collaborate with each other, to help push ideas forward together. And it's really intended for individuals and small teams at all sorts of levels and all sorts of organizations. So not for profits, people making change across society, individuals working to create changes, and also people in large organizations. We certainly get a lot of people who are trying to get more design thinking, more creativity, more innovation, and also digital transformation going in their companies. So we're so excited in November to launch this course. We'll share more information out via our web channels. And the last thing I want to share is that we do have 2 special slots for teams. So teams are people around 10 individuals plus who want to come together and take this course together. And the great thing about that is then you have a common language, a common zeitgeist, more co-conspirators to work with and share with, and really support each other through those friction points on a journey of change. So huge thanks to Bryan. Thank you for making this course with us. Thank you for coming today to share. And we'll be sharing out this recording very soon. Thanks for joining us.